Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Lifting up his eyes then and seeing a large crowd that was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" He said this to test him, for he knew himself what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they for so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves. When he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, "Gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world." When I first read this gospel lesson assigned to today's lectionary, I rolled my eyes. The past several weeks, we have read scriptures from the Gospel of Mark, who I find easier to preach on. But today's text comes from the Gospel of John, and we are blessed with not one, but 2 miracle stories. In the first one, as I just read, Jesus comes to the shore of Galilee and sees a crowd gathered. It's almost as if he saw this crowd and decided to run up the mountain so as not to be overwhelmed. He invited his disciples to go with him. But then the crowd starts coming towards him. We don't know if this was his preference or not, but he did not tell them to go away. He did not run from them. The first thing he does is ask his disciple Philip, "How will we feed all these people?" And then we know how the story goes from there. And in the second miracle story, the disciples are in a boat on the lake heading towards Capernaum, and the seas grow rough and they grow frightened. That seems to happen a lot in the gospel stories. But then they saw Jesus walking on the water, and he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." I don't particularly love preaching on the miracle stories, not because I think there's anything wrong with them, but because they're so easily misinterpreted. I think they should have "handle with care" written across the top, because they can really be manipulated to say what serves our best interests. I try to avoid reducing a story to its simplest, easy to understand interpretation. But since I don't know the real interpretation, if there is one, and since we don't know the factual historical events because each of the Gospels presents these stories a little bit differently, because I wasn't there, I am as susceptible as anyone to fall into the trap of self-serving interpretation. I think these miracle stories can let us off the hook. We read them, and the writer of the Gospel of John presents a very omnipotent side of Jesus. We think, great, God worked through Jesus, God has it all under control, God will make manna rain down from heaven. We are depraved and imperfect. We cannot possibly feed everyone, so we don't need to do anything. Or, in an effort to avoid that pitfall, we might convince ourselves that we have to solve all of the world's problems under the idea that God is working through us. So we swing too far to the other interpretation, we read this same story, and we tell ourselves that we need to single-handedly feed the 5,000 or the 7 billion. And we forget that we are just a small part of God's bigger plan. So what do we do with this? What do we do with a text which has so many different meanings buried within it? I think what's so powerful about this text is that Jesus redefines what is possible for his followers and for his future followers, us today. He was ministering to people who lived under the most horrific and oppressed conditions, surrounded daily by death, disease, famine. There was a strict social class of haves and have-nots that could not be broken. You were born into a class, and you died into that same social status. When I was attending Union Theological Seminary, we would have lunches called stone soup. Some of you may be familiar with this concept. And at these lunches, anyone who wanted to would gather at a specific time and place and bring whatever extra food they had lying around their kitchen. It might be vegetables that needed to be eaten, or maybe a box of pasta, or a frozen pizza, whatever it was that they had to offer. They brought it to stone soup, and we created a meal out of it. Sometimes the meals were weird, and unlikely ingredients were paired together, but it was always delicious. Now, maybe Jesus did make the bread and fish magically multiply and overflow in 12 baskets. Or maybe they were bottomless baskets that kept refilling themselves as they got passed around. I don't know. But I imagine this story kind of like my stone soup experience. The Passover feast was near, so imagine if Peter identified the young boy with the barley loaves and the fish, and those got passed around, and then others saw what he was doing, and they took out what they had. Perhaps some in the crowd had bread, fish, maybe they had wine or some fruit, and if everyone offered what they had with them, they could have had a feast. Then there was so much food that the excess was gathered up and given to the local food pantry so that nothing went to waste. This is my version of the story. I think that all too often we become so short-sighted. We're too focused on the trivial problems in our lives, and we lose scope of the possibilities around us. We forget to remember that there is plenty to go around. There is plenty of food, clothing, shelter, medical care to serve all of the world. But some people are hoarding the resources. Some of us are sitting in the crowd with our riches, too afraid to share them. So when we look around, everyone looks destitute and poor. Everyone looks like they're suffering. But imagine if those few in the crowd that had so much, imagine if they revealed their wealth and shared it. There would be much more than enough to go around. And we aren't to be wasteful with these things either. As Jesus says, we are to save the excess. Perhaps save the excess for the next generation. The limited resources that are here, we are called to preserve those for those that come after us, so they might prosper as well. But I think any of us can fall into the trap of self-preservation. We want to look out for and protect what is ours and ours alone. But we are reminded that everything we have is a gift, and nobody gets where they are in isolation. If you've had any successes in your life, I imagine you can think of at least a few people that helped you get there. I certainly know that I was not able to go through seminary and go through the ordination process without the support of many people. For those of us who are blessed, we owe it in part to the generosity of others. But then we forget to pay it forward. We forget that we are a large part of interconnected web of humanity, and together we survive or perish. Theologian Douglas John Hall says that what's so remarkable about this story is the hope that Jesus inspired in his followers. He suggests that Jesus' powerful presence and deep compassion for their suffering and need might explain the ability of these ordinary, insecure, and timid people to walk where they hadn't walked before. I hope that our faith compels us to walk where we wouldn't otherwise go, to give what we wouldn't otherwise give. One problem I see with Jesus' followers, and perhaps I see myself reflected in them in this story, is that they always seem to be asking Jesus what he can do for them, what handouts he can offer them, how he can feed them, heal them, how he can comfort them. But there aren't many examples of his disciples asking him what they can do for him, how they can help him. How they can help him challenge the authority and create the world that he envisioned. that God called them to create, where everyone is cared for. For the most part, I think most of us can say that our basic needs are met. Yes, there are people in our communities and abroad who do not have stable housing, employment, or food, and they offer us an incredible opportunity to serve them. But for those of us who are comfortable, what do we have to offer? How can we serve? We all know that cliche line, to give is much more than to receive, but I think it is so true. And after seeing the miracle of all the people being fed, the crowd said, "Surely this is the prophet who has come into the world." In the book of Deuteronomy, the Jews are promised a prophet like Moses who will rise up and lead them. And in this moment after the feeding, they think this prophet is Jesus. But the problem is that they want to make him their king. They're looking for their second King David. In the next verse, the writer says, Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. He didn't want to become their king, ruling over them like a monarch. That was the hierarchical system that he was trying to abolish. He wanted to do away with the clients and patron system of the rigid and oppressive Roman Empire, where those on the bottom were indebted to those on the top, and those on the top had abundant riches over those on the bottom, and they were just entitled to them. But this is the very leadership role that his followers are trying to put him into, and yet he resists it. It's ironic that they are seeking freedom from this very empire and that they want him to recreate the same structure. Later in the Gospel of John, just before his death, Jesus says that the kingdom of God is not of this world. He sees beyond this world, beyond the fears and the trivialities that hold us back. He challenges us to see beyond that, to see the potential that we as humanity have. He teaches us to be grateful and appreciative of all that we've been given, to be immersed in God's grace and celebrate this God-given life that we are all so blessed to have. I think we sometimes pay too much attention to our individuality and the success of each individual person, and we lose sight of the well-being of the whole human family that Jesus came to advocate for. Jesus walked on water, and he calmed the disciples down. They were in a small boat amid stormy seas, but they were afraid and stressed, and he walked up to them on that water. And personally, if I was frightened and if I saw my teacher walking on water, I'd probably fall out of the boat due to sheer shock, and I'd probably think I was hallucinating. But somehow his actions calmed them down, and he told them not to be afraid, not to worry about the small problems in their lives. There have certainly been times in my life when I have been stressed or uncertain. I don't do well in liminal spaces, and this search process has been very trying for me. But I center myself, I pray, and I remember that everything is bigger than me, than my problems, which keep me up at night. And we are here for a much greater purpose. We are called to serve the needs of the world, to walk humbly with God, but to remember that we cannot do everything because we are part of a bigger whole. We can only bring a small piece of food to that table, to that gathering on the grass, but that piece is essential because when it gets added to everyone else's small contribution of food, a feast is created. If we take our riches, that which we have to offer, take them out of hiding, and we put them on the table, we will see how abundantly rich humanity truly is. We might not all have food or money to offer. We might have our hands, our ability to serve others. We might have a sensitive and patient spirit in which we're able to sit with someone in a time of need. But every one of us has something to bring to the feast, and in doing so, we are truly rewarded when we offer that which we have to give. So instead of asking our church, our God, our community, what it can do for us, we should instead ask how we can serve, what we have to offer, and see what happens, because the rewards will be so abundant. Amen.